George Washington grew it on his farm. The drafts of the United States Declaration of Independence were written on paper made from it. And the ships on which the British Empire conquered half the world simply would not have moved without its fibres. For thousands of years, this plant was the foundation of our civilization. But today, millions of people sit in prisons because of it. A staggering contradiction has emerged. Right now, you can walk into a legal, brightly lit boutique and purchase cannabis with a credit card, honestly paying all taxes. And in that exact same second, someone else is serving a decades-long sentence in a concrete cell for the exact same action. How did we get here? How did a plant that doctors prescribe to kings become the cause of the most destructive and expensive domestic war in modern history? It is not an accident. It is the result of a deliberate, century-long campaign of propaganda, racial targeting, and economic warfare. But the story of this plant does not begin in a modern dispensary, and it does not begin with a police raid. It starts at the very dawn of humanity. About 12,000 years ago, near the Altai Mountains in Central Asia, early humans were figuring out how to survive the end of the last ice age. They found a fast-growing, incredibly resilient weed thriving in the nutrient-rich soil left behind by retreating glaciers. When they pulled this plant from the earth, they did not just find a food source in its nutritious seeds. They discovered that the inner bark of its stalk could be stripped, twisted, and braided into something revolutionary: fibre. This was cannabis sativa. And for the first 10,000 years of its relationship with humanity, it was not famous for getting people high. It was famous for building the world. Ancient civilizations quickly realized that hemp, the fibrous, non-psychoactive variety of cannabis, was a miracle material. In ancient China, around 4000 BC, it was used to create the earliest known fishing nets, ropes, and eventually the very first paper. The earliest surviving piece of paper in human history, discovered in a Chinese tomb, is made of hemp. But the Chinese discovered something else too. The legendary Emperor Shen Nung, often considered the father of Chinese medicine, recorded the use of cannabis in his pharmacopoeia around 2700 BC. He noted that the flowering tops of the plant contained unique properties. He prescribed it for rheumatism, gout, and absent-mindedness. It was no longer just a useful material, it was medicine. As nomadic tribes like the Scythians moved across the Eurasian steppe, they brought cannabis with them. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote in the 5th century BC about Scythians throwing cannabis seeds onto hot stones inside enclosed tents, creating a thick smoke that they would inhale until they shouted for joy. It was one of the earliest documented cases of the plant being used for its psychoactive, mind-altering properties. The plant spread to the Indian subcontinent, where it became deeply entwined with spirituality and religion. In the sacred Hindu texts, the Vedas, cannabis was named one of the 5 sacred plants of the earth. It was believed that a guardian angel lived inside its leaves. A drink called bhang, a mixture of milk, spices, and cannabis, became a staple of religious festivals and a daily medicine. In India, cannabis was a gift from the gods. For centuries, this duality persisted. Cannabis was a workhorse of human industry and a revered medicine. There was no stigma. There was no war. In fact, when humanity entered the age of exploration, cannabis became the most strategically vital military and economic resource on the planet. You have to understand, without cannabis, the global empires of Europe would never have existed. Sailing ships required a staggering amount of hemp. A single standard British Navy vessel in the 16th century required over £120,000 of hemp just for its rigging, ropes, and sails. The word canvas itself comes from the Latin word canapacius, meaning made from hemp. The Spanish Armada, the British Royal Navy, the fleets of the Dutch East India Company, all of them were literally propelled across the oceans thanks to cannabis. It was so crucial for empire building that when the British colonised North America, they did not just advise farmers to grow it, they ordered them to do it. In 1619, the Virginia Assembly passed a law obligating every farmer to grow hemp. You could even use it to pay taxes in early America. George Washington grew it. Thomas Jefferson grew it. The drafts of the Declaration of Independence were written on hemp paper. For the first 300 years of American history, cannabis was as American as apple pie. Even the psychoactive, medicinal version of the plant was an absolutely normal phenomenon. By the late 1800s, if you went to a pharmacy in New York or London with a headache, stomach cramps, or insomnia, the pharmacist would most likely take a dark glass bottle with a cannabis tincture off the shelf. It is a known fact that Queen Victoria's personal physician prescribed her cannabis to relieve menstrual cramps, calling it one of the most valuable medicines we possess. So how did a plant that built the modern world, a plant prescribed to monarchs and mandated by founding fathers, become the target of the most expensive and destructive domestic war in modern history? The answer is a toxic mix of racism, economic panic, and political ambition. The shift began in the early 20th century. Following the Mexican Revolution of 1910, a massive wave of Mexican immigrants crossed the border into the southwestern United States looking for refuge and work. And they brought with them a cultural habit that was largely unfamiliar to the white American middle class: smoking the dried flowers of the cannabis plant for recreation. They called it marijuana. At the time, Americans were perfectly comfortable with cannabis, the purified liquid medicine in their medicine cabinets. But the word marijuana sounded foreign. It sounded exotic. And in a country deeply gripped by xenophobia and racial tension, it sounded dangerous. Local politicians and newspapers in Texas and California began publishing sensational stories. They claimed this Mexican weed was causing waves of violent crime. They wrote that it gave men superhuman strength and an uncontrollable lust for blood. The term marijuana was deliberately injected into the public vocabulary to distance the drug from the cannabis that Americans knew and trusted, directly linking it to the marginalized immigrant population. This racial framing was incredibly effective. By the 1920s, Western states began banning the plant, relying not on medical science, but purely to target and control Mexican communities. Soon, the narrative expanded to include jazz musicians in places like New Orleans and Harlem. Black jazz performers like Louis Armstrong spoke completely openly about their use of marijuana. Suddenly, the media started spinning a new, frightening narrative. This drug makes white women listen to jazz music and fraternize with black men. This is the part of the story where the architect of the war enters the stage. His name was Harry Anslinger. In 1930, Anslinger was appointed the first commissioner of the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger was an ambitious, deeply racist bureaucrat looking for an excuse to justify his agency's budget. Alcohol prohibition was ending, which meant thousands of federal agents were about to be left without a job. Anslinger needed a new enemy. He chose marijuana. Anslinger launched one of the most aggressive and fabricated public relations campaigns in history. He gathered a collection of carefully selected, often entirely fabricated police reports about brutal murders and attributed them all to marijuana. He called it the Gore File. He testified before Congress, stating on the record that marijuana is the assassin of youth and that it causes temporary insanity. He did not do this alone. Anslinger had powerful allies, primarily William Randolph Hearst, a wealthy media tycoon who owned a massive chain of newspapers. Hearst hated the Mexican immigrants who had seized some of his timberlands in Mexico during the Revolution. He also had huge investments in the timber and paper industries. At exactly the same time, a new invention called the decorticator made processing hemp cheaper and faster than ever, threatening to replace wood-based paper with hemp-based paper. Hearst used his newspapers to spread Anslinger's anti-marijuana propaganda across the entire country. The propaganda reached its peak in 1936 with the release of the infamous film Reefer Madness, funded by a church group. It showed teenagers taking just one puff and immediately falling into a psychotic frenzy of murder, suicide, and sexual depravity. Looking back at it today, the film seems like a comical absurdity, but to the naive American public of the 1930s, it was terrifying. In 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing the plant nationwide. The hearings for this landmark law lasted only a few hours. The American Medical Association fiercely objected, pointing out that marijuana was just a slang term for cannabis, a medicine they had been safely prescribing for decades. Their objections were completely ignored. With the stroke of a pen, a product that had been the foundation of human civilization for 10,000 years was outlawed, and the war officially began. For the next few decades, cannabis was driven underground, becoming a countercultural symbol. But it was not until the 1970s that the crusade against marijuana turned into a full-scale, militarized war. In 1971, President Richard Nixon addressed the American public and declared drug abuse public enemy number one. He officially launched the War on Drugs. Nixon pushed through the Controlled Substances Act, which categorized all drugs into different schedules. Against the advice of his own scientific commission, which concluded that marijuana was not particularly dangerous and should be decriminalized, Nixon placed marijuana in Schedule 1. This was the strictest category, reserved for drugs with a high potential for abuse and absolutely no recognized medical use, right alongside heroin. By law, the United States government declared that marijuana was more dangerous than cocaine and methamphetamine. Why would Nixon do this against the advice of his own scientists? We do not have to guess. In 1994, Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, gave an interview in which he confessed the true motive. He said, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. We knew we could not make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This is the part that should make you angry. The war on drugs was never about public health. It was a calculated political weapon. The consequences of this decision were apocalyptic. Under Nixon, and later under Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, the war escalated. Mandatory minimum sentences were introduced. Police departments across the country were militarized, handed surplus military equipment to conduct raids on homes looking for a plant. The prison population in the United States skyrocketed. By the late 1990s, the US was arresting hundreds of thousands of people every single year for marijuana possession. The overwhelming majority of those arrested were black and Latino, despite study after study proving that white people use and sell marijuana at the exact same rates. Entire communities were devastated. Fathers were taken from their children, families were bankrupted, and millions of people received felony records that prevented them from ever getting a good job, housing, or the right to vote. Marijuana did not just fuel a domestic war, it created a shadow economy. By making the most widely consumed illicit drug in the world illegal, Western governments handed a monopoly to violent criminal cartels. In Mexico and South America, the black market for cannabis generated billions of dollars in untaxed, unregulated revenue. It funded private armies, bought politicians, and led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians in cartel violence. We repeated the exact same mistake we made during Prohibition, but we did it on a global scale and for an entire century. And then, slowly, this narrative began to fall apart. The turning point did not come from politicians, it came from the dying. In the 1980s and 90s, the AIDS epidemic was tearing through minority communities, especially in San Francisco. Patients were wasting away, unable to eat due to severe nausea caused by the disease and toxic early medications.
An activist named Dennis Perron noticed that cannabis was one of the only things that brought back his dying partner's appetite and relieved his pain. Perron opened an underground illegal cannabis buyers club in San Francisco, literally risking federal prison to hand out marijuana to patients dying of AIDS and cancer. The government could not spin this picture. These were not dangerous cartels or crazed jazz musicians. These were terminally ill people finding relief in a plant. In 1996, thanks to relentless grassroots activism, California became the first state to legalize medical marijuana. The dam had broken. Over the next 20 years, the science that Harry Anslinger had tried to bury finally surfaced. Researchers discovered the endocannabinoid system, a vast network of receptors in the human brain and body that literally evolved to interact with the compounds found in the cannabis plant. It turned out that Shen Nung was right 5,000 years ago. The plant was medicine.
It showed massive potential in treating childhood epilepsy, chronic pain, and multiple sclerosis. Today, the situation has changed with breathtaking speed. The majority of US states have legalized marijuana in one form or another. Entire countries, such as Canada, Uruguay, and Germany, have legalized it at the federal level. The plant that was once blamed for the collapse of society is now a global industry, projected to be worth over $100 billion by 2030. But this new green rush has a deeply bitter irony. While corporate executives, many of whom are former politicians and police chiefs who once waged the war on drugs, sit on the boards of public companies, making millions in profit, the victims of the war remain. In many places, you can still be fired from your job for a positive cannabis test. And hundreds of thousands of people around the world still sit in prison cells, their lives ruined by convictions for possessing a plant that is now sold in elegant retail stores just a few steps away. The system has changed, but the debt has not been paid. The story of marijuana stretches from the icy steppes of ancient Asia to the wooden decks of global armadas, from the jazz clubs of Harlem to the militarized police raids of the 20th century. It is a story that proves how easily truth can be manufactured, how quickly society can be manipulated by fear, and how destructive the law can be when used as a weapon rather than a shield. A simple, fibrous weed that helped humans survive the Ice Age became an excuse to strip millions of people of their freedom. And as the world finally wakes up from a century of propaganda, the plant remains exactly what it has always been, waiting in the dirt, quietly outliving the empires that tried to destroy it. If this story surprised you, subscribe to the channel to learn more about the hidden histories of everyday things.